Buenas tardes nuevamente desde la Escuela Española de Historia y Arqueología del CSIC en Roma, después del día de ayer con Oliver Craig. Sí que es cierto que normalmente hacemos una conferencia al mes, pero en esta ocasión hacemos dos. Nuevamente bienvenidos a todos y a todas a este nuevo seminario que, como siempre decimos y recordamos, lo hacemos juntos a Miriam Cubas de la Universidad de Alcalá y Harry Robson de la Universidad de York, y que siempre decimos, porque para nosotros es importante, que en la parte técnica está Matteo Benati y en toda la parte organizativa los compañeros y compañeras del CSIC en Roma. Y hoy tenemos como conferenciante, para nosotros es un honor tener como conferenciante a la profesora Amy Beaugard, que hará la presentación. Inicialmente Harry introducirá quién es Amy Beaugard, que evidentemente su inglés es mejor que el mío. Please, Harry.
Yeah, thank you very much, Juan. Yeah, it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Amy Beaugard here today on our final online Mesolithic Neolithic transitional talks today. And just a brief overview, Amy obtained her PhD from the University of Sheffield in 2002. And then between 2003 and 2007, Amy was a lecturer in archaeological science at the University of Nottingham. And since 2007, Amy has been an associate professor of Neolithic and Bronze Age archaeology at the University of Oxford. With this professional title, professorial title, should I say, starting in 2014. Amy is an archaeologist, archaeobotanist who is interested in early farming practices in Western Asia and Europe, and undertakes comparative analyses in other parts of the world, as well as in present-day organic farming. So welcome, Amy, and really looking forward to your talk. So please, as and when you are ready, start.
Thanks so much, Harry, and thanks so much, Juan, for your kind introduction and for the opportunity to take part in this series on the Mesolithic Neolithic transition. I'm just going to endeavor to share screen and to get into presenter mode. Maybe, Harry, you could give me a thumbs up when that's visible. Thank you very much. So delighted to be here and to have the opportunity to contribute. And I guess it's safe to say that the current period of reduced mobility, with the pandemic situation and now the Omicron situation, is, if nothing else, giving us an opportunity for reflection and of reassessing priorities. And I think this is true also of Mesolithic Neolithic studies, which has been captured so well in this seminar series. I also think it's safe to say that central to the current moment of reflection on our priorities in this scholarly area is the Paleogenomic Revolution. And that is actually my starting point for this talk. So we will all be familiar now with principal components analysis plots like this, and this way of visualizing the power of whole genome sequencing of ancient human DNA. And in this plot, that's being projected onto an array of Western Eurasian modern human populations. And this kind of exploratory principal components analysis is inviting us to look at relatedness, relationships between individuals from different regions and periods. And if we zoom in on one of the key clusters here, this is from the same paper, Matheson et al. 2018, but I could have chosen any of a number of the armada of papers that have come at us from this kind of work. If we zoom into that central cluster, we see the Anatolian Neolithic, which is shown in orange, and the earlier European Neolithic, here called European Neolithic I, as closely adjacent and overlapping clusters. And that adjacentness then interpreted as Anatolian ancestry in these early European farmer communities. And we then see a drift of the later European Neolithic, what's labeled here as European Neolithic II, towards the hunter-gatherer array on the left-hand side of this plot. And that has been interpreted as will be well known to this audience, as increasing hunter-gatherer admixture through time, with the implication that farming and hunter-gatherer enclaves had continued to coexist and were interacting increasingly through time, in especially the middle and later Neolithic. And this has been understood as fitting well with the idea of pioneer colonization, or leapfrog colonization, as it's sometimes called, depicted here in a well-known sort of spatial graphic by Marix Available in 1986, as a kind of halfway house between demic diffusion on the one hand and the availability model or the availability scenario on the other. And so it would seem through this paleogenomic work that we are coming very close to the point where we begin to outgrow these models, where the evidence is actually enabling us to address these scenarios. And therefore, answers are increasingly forthcoming as to the long-standing whodunit debate about demic diffusion and the identity, at least in a genetic sense, of early farmers. But even as ancient DNA provides new evidential grounding for demographic connections and admixture, it also provides new scope to move beyond the question of who, at least in a genetic barcoding sense, to questions of how and even why neolithization occurs. And this is where I think the nature of farming and its social consequences can finally play an appropriate explanatory role in the Neolithic process, not as a blurred reflection of who early farmers were genetically, but how they successfully established themselves in new ecological and social settings in different landscapes across Europe, and why some were compelled to do so. And to sort of chart this discussion, I wanted to give you a sense of how I'd like to approach this in segments. I actually want to start by sketching out a conceptual framework that I hope you'll find interesting and stimulating for this discussion, which is around this term process archaeology, which I will define in counterpoint to processual and post-processual. I then want to talk about Çatalhöyük actually as an Anatolian snapshot of what an early farming community could look like in the early to mid 7th millennium BC, which is the time frame of early farming establishment around the Aegean in Europe. I then want to look at some Greek Neolithic case studies where we've been trying to pinpoint some of the agroecological detail of exactly how cultivation and herding are organized and the ecological ramifications of that, and trying to get from the notion of any kind of fixed package to the process that I'm advocating should now be our top priority. And then in the final part of the talk, and very briefly, I would like to reassess what this all might lead us towards if we were to undertake a process archaeology of neolithization. So I'd actually like to start by reaching all the way back to some philosophy from the early 20th century, and to this quote from the work of Alfred North Whitehead from one of his more accessible books, Adventures of Ideas, that was published in 1933, and to a philosophy, a metaphysics that he variously calls process-oriented, or sometimes it's been referred to as a philosophy of organism, so seeing the world as organism-like. And I'm just going to read this quote out to you to try and give you a sense of what he's getting at here. The very essence of real actuality, that is, of the completely real, is process. Thus, each actual thing is only to be understood in terms of its becoming and perishing. There is no halt in which the actuality is just its static self, accidentally played upon by qualifications derived from the shift of circumstances. The converse is the truth. So I hope that conjures for you a sense of a philosophy where everything is processual. Everything is a process in the act of becoming and perishing. And this kind of philosophy, which has reemerged in of something of interest across the social sciences in recent decades, has also prompted a new kind of attention to process in our discipline, in archaeology. And I'm just going to try and advance, there we go. And this is a paper that was published in 2015 in World Archaeology in one of the debates issues by Chris Gosden and Lambros Malafouris. And it is a provocation to take process in this Whiteheadian sense of everything being a process rather than a static thing, in a way that archaeology, they argue, is uniquely positioned to do. And in fact, with Lambros and Chris as co-editors, we've been taking this further in a thematic issue of World Archaeology that I hope is going to come out by the end of this year, and where we have been eliciting from our contributors considerations of process archaeology in relation to, for example, the archaeology of mind, hermeneutics, material culture, technology, and so on. So that is something that I hope you will look out for. But I need to now properly frame the question, why is archaeology so amenable to apprehending process? One obvious reason is that archaeology uniquely captures phenomena that are extended in time, that is, that play out over long chronological periods. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't also think about processes that are virtually instantaneous and even difficult, for example, to capture with the naked eye. And I thought I'd use as an illustration of this, a very striking photo that has come out of project work by Lambros Malafouris. This is the ERC funded handmade project based here in Oxford. And as it explains in the caption here, it was captured using a very slow shutter speed to enable us to see the moving hands of a potter. His name is Kostas Thepastas on the island of Sifnos, as he is working with a ball of clay. And the word that's used on the island for this kind of starting point, this ball of clay, is kavula. And this is something that we use as a metaphor, as an example of process in the introduction to that special issue of World Archaeology that will be coming out and published online very soon. So it's this process of becoming, this capturing of a dynamic, ever-changing situation that we're arguing archaeology is particularly well positioned to capture, to apprehend. Now, it's important to be clear here that in this Whiteheadian process sense, we are not advocating a return to 1960s processual archaeology. Because somewhat ironically, and though Whiteheadian philosophy and other process philosophy was at large by the 1960s when the new archaeology emerged, the form of process that the new archaeologists like Kent Flannery, Lewis Binford, and others were interested in were actually highly generalized notions of how things function from a body of work sometimes known as general systems theory. So this is a completely generalizing framework that is entirely uninterested in the highly contingent and complex contingencies of local becoming processes that we are drawing attention to now through process archaeology. And I've highlighted a particular quote here from a paper from Kent Flannery published in 1967, where he's talking about the process school of archaeology, but he's clearly interested in processes, systems that are basic, that are natural, that are not specifically cultural and human related at all. And to take a key theme that was of interest to 1960s new archaeology, or processual archaeology, that is domestication, the emergence of farming. This is also, I think, a model or a notion that we have to reconsider and that possibly we are outgrowing. We need to step back from the notion of domestication as any kind of state of control or achievement, whether that's intentional or unintentional. So this isn't coming back to this question of conscious and unconscious selection. It's the degree to which that process really is human-centered and oriented towards human goals and human agency. We really have to get back to the practices that were concerned with plants and animals that we come to call domesticated, and with the agencies involved that could take us radically away from human intention. And one of the sort of iconic images that we use to conjure this in that paper on reconsidering domestication is this photograph of Lord Walter Rothschild in front of the Royal Albert Hall, and apparently driving a carriage that is drawn by zebras, and therefore demonstrating mastery, domestication of this untamed animal. But the sharp-eyed amongst you will notice, well, it's mentioned in the caption of this now as well, that there is a disguised horse in the mix at the back of the front pair. So it really is an illusion of control and of mastery. And I think that actually permeates much of what we think we know, or we think we're trying to explain with domestication, which turns out to be a European colonial project. And one of the co-authors of that paper, Charles Stepanov, and also Jean-Denis Ving and others, have written very powerfully about this elsewhere. So that is a kind of, I hope, a provocation to take process archaeology seriously as a perspective that may just begin to shed new light and prompt us to ask new questions about many things, but including early farming and domestication, and as we will see, Neolithization in Europe. So how do we then take this kind of process thinking of the emergence of something that we come to call the Neolithic back to the whole area of Neolithization and farming practice? Well, the way I would like to do this is by looking closely at a particular snapshot of the Anatolian Neolithic, which is in the right time frame and the right cultural background to be relevant to early European Neolithization. And so Çatalhöyük in south-central Turkey, so in the southern Konya Plain, gives us a particularly well-documented sequence for considering all kinds of social practice, but particularly as it pertains to farming and the handling of farmed produce, as I'm going to show you shortly. This is a sequence that I think will be familiar to everyone in the audience. So I'm just going to mention a couple of strategic details. This is a double mound site. There is an east and a west mound on either side of the present day Çarşamba River that flows past the site. The east mound is the focus of the Neolithic occupation that is more or less the 7th millennium BC. And the west mound across the river channel, the present day river channel, is the earlier 6th millennium occupation, what in the local culture historical sequence is the early Chalcolithic. So altogether, we're talking about roughly a 1500-year occupation. And that fact of long-term sustainability and resilience is part of the background that I want to draw your attention to here. But I'm actually going to zoom straight into some very particular aspects of the archaeology, and as we will see shortly, of the architecture. This is all drawing upon results of the 25-year project that finished in 2017, led by Ian Hodder at Stanford. And the photographs here are of some examples of really well-preserved charred or carbonized plant material which constitutes some of our most direct evidence of food-related practice and farming at the site, and was my particular research interest as a member of a large archaeobotanical team working there. And so what's unique about this assemblage is that because there was systematic sampling, meticulous excavation, and an on-site laboratory, we could do a lot of careful analytical work almost in real time with the excavation. And as a result, we have one of the largest data sets for any archaeological site, not just in Western Asia, but I think in Western Eurasia. There are over 10,000 samples that were taken, and nearly 1,000 were analyzed in detail by, as I say, a large and really amazing archaeobotanical team that worked there over the years. So one of the headlines that came out of this work is that there is just an incredibly diverse repertoire of plant food right the way through that extended occupation sequence. And there are 20 odd, more than 20 food plants that are routinely encountered, and that we are not only calling food plants because they are potentially edible, but for which we actually have processing and or storage evidence for. So these were definitely regarded as consumables, as edibles by Çatalhöyük inhabitants. That's how they're handled. And that really ground truth that this is truly a diverse, agrobiodiverse system, encompassing not just a whole array of different kinds of wheats, different kinds of barleys, different kinds of pulses, but also a broad suite of fruits and nuts and herbaceous wild plants as well that are recruited into the food system. And that diversity is certainly one of the reasons for this long-term resilience that I've already made reference to. There is, of course, demographic waxing and waning through the sequence, but the key to it is resilience, including that shift from the East Mound to the West Mound. And in this paper from 2017, with a whole series of co-authors, one of the arguments that we try to develop is that Çatalhöyük is a really good example of what ecologists call a panarchy. That is, in this case, a non-hierarchical interacting set of nested, that is spatially and temporally nested units, most obviously households, as we see them in this architectural form that's illustrated in the plan in the lower left-hand part of the slide and in the photograph next to it. So these modular household units, which are all doing slightly different things. They're experimenting with different plants, they're favoring different crops, they're collecting different fruits and nuts in some cases. We see this from evidence of in situ burning activities in these houses. So we can document this as occurring, the use of these overlapping but different sets of plants, ground truth through in situ burning. And it shows us, we think, that there was a kind of collective ecological knowledge that was developed through the interaction of these independently acting, creatively experimenting household units. And that's getting very close to what Gunderson and Holling, in a book that many of you will again be familiar with, describe as a panarchical form of resilience. It's resilience through the interaction of these different units that can learn from each other's mistakes, that can adopt each other's successful strategies. Something else that's key here that I want to emphasize is that though we have all kinds of material culture evidence for complex networks that connect these households, not just in local neighborhood groups, but also across the settlement, we also have evidence that they are set up to be somewhat independent of each other, certainly as regards management of food resources. And this is most obviously shown through the location of storage facilities. So each of the buildings that you see in the light gray shading in the lower left-hand corner were burned, and I'm going to come back to house burning as a kind of closure activity and the point in the Neolithic sequence where that arises is very interesting. But what that preserves is in situ evidence of what these different households are storing in side rooms, sometimes in alcoves in a main room, but variously in places where they could be packed away, sequestered, potentially hidden. So household storage is a relatively private concern, a relatively hidden part of household activity, and that's something I want to come back to shortly. Now, to take a bit of a leap, because if you're not going to speculate in a research seminar during a pandemic, when are you going to speculate? So I've decided I'm going to go a bit speculative in this talk, and I hope that that isn't too disturbing. The time frame that I'm drawing upon particularly with these burned houses happens to be the middle part of the Neolithic sequence at Çatalhöyük, which dates around 67 to 6500 BC. That is actually the time frame, or it overlaps with the time frame of early farming establishment, very earliest European Neolithization around the Aegean, which I'm going to talk a bit more about later. And so what I'm suggesting, speculative though it may be, is that the tensions, as I'm about to describe them, that are beginning to arise in the middle Neolithic part of this Çatalhöyük sequence, that is tensions between households that are also enmeshed in all kinds of obligations with each other in this densely crowded settlement, which is reaching its maximum size in this middle Neolithic timeframe, is providing us with some of the motives that we might want to think about for the dispersal of households into new landscapes for farming, Western Anatolia, Crete, around the Aegean, and ultimately elsewhere in Europe. So I do think we should start to look very carefully at what we know from well-documented sequences like Çatalhöyük in Anatolia to understand some of the motives for households wanting to escape the panarchy. And something that I've already mentioned, but I haven't fully unpacked yet, is this practice of house burning. So house burning is something that emerges in this part of the sequence that had already been well documented by James Mellert in the 1960s. It continues as a practice periodically in the later Neolithic sequence at Çatalhöyük too, but it's particularly concentrated in the middle Neolithic. And so one of the questions I want to kind of pose here is, why is that happening? Because we know it involves the deliberate destruction of food, of other consumables, of material culture. And again, this is another speculative step, so just to warn you, I think we do need to think about the tensions that are emerging in this early farming community amongst households which, on the one hand, are closely interdigitated with one another and developing all kinds of, as I've said, complex obligations to one another, but on the other hand, are trying to store their own produce, their own agricultural produce. Now, this is a graphic from a paper that we published a couple of years ago, where we're actually looking at potential wealth inequality. And we're doing that on the basis of the distribution of household spaces, especially household size, I should say, but especially storage area, where we had storage capacity data. And we're looking at the equality of distribution of storage capacity. And that equality of distribution is being measured through something called the Genie Coefficient that will be familiar to some of you, I'm sure. This is a measure of the distribution, equality of distribution of, could be anything, any kind of resource or wealth from economics, where one is a highly unequal distribution, one unit holds all the wealth, through to zero, where everything is equally spread amongst all units. And I just want to draw your attention to the fact that Çatalhöyük, in its middle Neolithic phase specifically, has quite a high Gini coefficient, meaning the distribution of storage capacity, which I would take to be a plausible proxy for agricultural production and income, if you like, is relatively high. And I think it is interesting to consider how this may be connected to the whole practice of house burning that is initiated in this phase, and of the possibility that that is a leveling mechanism. And that's a possibility actually that Karen Wright at UCL has mentioned in relation to some groundstone tool evidence that I'll show you shortly. So what I'm trying to suggest is that in this Anatolian snapshot from Çatalhöyük, we can see in a labor-limited agricultural system where everything comes down to how much human labor you can mobilize to conduct whatever it is you're trying to conduct, or it could be agricultural production, it could be all kinds of things, that in this middle Neolithic phase, a kind of limit is being reached of what is tolerable level of inequality. You may be aware that Ian Hodder has written very, I think, compellingly on Çatalhöyük as an aggressively egalitarian community. And I think that's right, but it's aggressive precisely because there are tensions moving in the opposite direction around the differential ability of households to mobilize labor for their own agricultural production. And so the result, I'm arguing, is house burning, is the destruction of some houses, including their contents. Now, this is building 52, one of the burned Middle Neolithic buildings that I've showed you in that simplified plan before. This is what it looked like after complete clearance of all of the in situ storage evidence. But just to remind you that the layout of the house is very evocative of some of the tensions that are trying to be balanced here. So we see in the foreground, if you can follow my cursor, a storage room that would have been crawled into from the side. That storage room is lined with bins, and we had been busy for weeks in the excavation of this room, clearing those bins of in situ plant material that was being stored there. There were other consumables as well, bones for making bone points and so on. That's a relatively sequestered hidden space that you would crawl into from a series of rooms, if you can follow my cursor going back this way. In this main room, which you would enter from a ladder along this wall that I'm gesturing to now, as you entered the room, one of the first things you would see is this bucranium set into a niche next to a horned bench of the type that Mellert had documented in other burned houses of this Middle Neolithic kind of phase in the 1960s. So you're immediately confronted with parts of wild cattle, by preference wild male cattle, which are relating to undoubtedly all kinds of things, but amongst other things, the sharing of very large carcasses and feasting events. So on the one hand, there is this kind of advertisement of past sharing potentially hosted by this household. And on the other hand, this hidden and sequestered practice of plant storage. So this is the tension that is being balanced in this spatial arrangement of the house. And you see a different version of this in building 77, another burned building in the same general neighborhood of the site and of the same general period in this mid-Neolithic part of the sequence. Here there is a really substantial side storage room with two big clay bins, each of them about 1 meter cubed in volume, which is large by Çatalhöyük standards. So this is one of the larger storage capacities that I referred to before. You can also see in the main space that would have been entered again through a ladder from above, a very rich floor assemblage, lots and lots of brownstone tool implements. These have been described now by Christina Tsohaki as well as Karen Wright. And it's Karen actually that has raised this possibility of burning as a kind of leveling mechanism. And I threw in some snapshots here also just because it's some of the most interesting material I've ever seen, but of the in situ charred plant evidence that we have in the lower images. This is pertaining to the storage of hulled wheat in that side room. And in the upper images, this is pertaining to a kind of prepared food that was very small fish mixed with peas and barley grain in a basket or some other perishable container in the main space. It was one of the deliberately structured left deposits as part of this prior to this burning closure activity. So we're looking at the deliberate destruction of goods, including stored crops and material culture. And these burned houses give us a particularly clear idea of the tensions that are being balanced, and where they become no longer sustainable could be a motivating factor for households to escape the panarchy, is what I'm suggesting. Okay, I now want to take a bit of a look at what's happening beginning in around this time frame of the mid-7th millennium, but then I'm going to fast forward into the later Neolithic at some Greek Neolithic case studies, and trying to move from this idea of a static Neolithic package to go with the barcoding of people coming from Anatolia, and towards this idea of really understanding the dynamics of the process involved. And so just some images to conjure up this kind of context, but I would like to start by asking you to imagine a subset of households from a place, doesn't have to be Çatalhöyük, but from a long-lived Anatolian settlement. And those households wish to establish themselves in a completely new setting, and for all kinds of interesting reasons that I hope we'll come back to later. And that could be a setting in Western Anatolia, it could be Knossos on Crete, why not? It could be somewhere in mainland Greece. But the question is, what's involved in that? What is going to be inevitably of concern to those households that are setting themselves up in a completely new area? Well, any farmer will tell you that they need to be worried about soils. They need to be worried about precipitation, the weather. They need to be aware of peculiarities of local flora, fauna, materials available. All of this is going to require adjustment, no matter how well prepared they think they are. The most predictable agricultural production will take place in intensively managed conditions where there's quite a lot of buffering against the vagaries of weather and soil condition and so on. But that intensive management itself is going to depend on available human labor and coordination of that labor. Coordination of that labor, in turn, is going to articulate with households, with these co-residential units that we saw in such clear architectural form at Çatalhöyük. Now, something that Kostas Kotsakis has recently drawn our attention to, if you attended his lecture in the NeoNet conference that took place through the Spanish School in Rome in September, organized by Miriam and Juan. And something that Kostas pointed out is that if you compare roughly contemporary mid-7th millennium settlements on either side of the Aegean, so for example, Ulucak, which is shown here in comparison with Mavropigi, which is in Western Greek Macedonia, you see very, very different sequences and very different expression of household units. So in the Ulucak example, it's quite reminiscent, at least in broad outline, of what we saw at Çatalhöyük. We have very clearly defined modular household units with internal storage and cooking facilities and so on. In the case of Mavropigi, though, which is the plan that you can see on the left-hand side that I'm gesturing to now, there are several phases of what appear to be pit houses of quite informal semi-subterranean domestic units prior to the phase, which I think is phase 3 in their stratigraphy, where you start to see rectangular modular household units emerge. In other words, the household itself is not immediately established. It takes some generations, it takes some time for the household to reemerge. And the household, I'm arguing, is the social corollary. It's the crucible of the farming system and of that organization of labor that is required for intensive small-scale farming. And so how does this staggered process of the emergence of the household relate to farming practice? Well, to answer that, I can fast forward to the 6th millennium, to what in the Greek chronology would be the Middle Neolithic or the late Neolithic, and to 3 Neolithic settlements in Greece that exemplify the diversity of Neolithic communities and agroecologies that develop over time. And I'm drawing here on work led by Petra Weiglova, who finished her PhD here in Oxford several years ago. And this is a paper that she led that was published this year. This was coming out of her doctoral work, but also out of an ERC-funded project, the AgriCurb project that I led, that also finished several years ago, but that we're still publishing from. And I'll refer back to AgriCurb a little bit more shortly. So these 3 settlements are Koufouvenou in the Peloponnese, Halai in eastern central Greece, and Makrialos up in the Thessaloniki region of northeastern Greece. They variously date to the 6th millennium, so Halai and Koufouvenou more or less date through the 6th millennium, so they have long sequences up to a millennium or more. Makrialos begins in the mid-6th millennium, this particular phase of Makrialos that we're going to talk about, and actually continues into the early 5th millennium in a later phase as well. The data I'm showing you here is stable carbon and isotope and nitrogen isotope data. And what was unusual is that we are integrating stable carbon and nitrogen isotope analysis of crops with the analysis of fauna, and in some cases, humans as well. So for Halai and Makrialos, so the left-hand and the central panel of the 3 graphs that you see, excuse me, we do have some human data. But in the case of Koufouvenou, we don't have a Neolithic human population to study, though there are some dogs that you can see sort of towards the top of the food chain here. So a couple things that I would like to draw your attention to with particular relevance to this Neolithization and farming practice as a process. So one thing to appreciate, and this was already obvious from the archaeobotany of these sites, is that they have somewhat distinct sets of crops that they are actually cultivating. So there is no single package, and this is now well known in the Neolithic of Greece, especially through the work of Tanya Valamotti and her students in the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, and that is that different communities, even within a region, but certainly different regions, become associated with overlapping but somewhat distinct repertoires in terms of their crop spectra. What we can additionally pick up on isotopically, if you can follow this quite complex legend on the right-hand side, you'll see that there are a whole array of crops that are being represented variously in these assemblages and that we can measure isotopically. There are some crops that do have quite a consistent isotopic signature from one settlement to another. So for example, einkorn wheat, which is this yellow circular symbol, both at Halai and at Koufouvenou tends to have quite low nitrogen values, as though there was an appreciation that einkorn, as is the case today with modern populations, can do quite well, can grow quite well, without much intensive input in the way of manuring, which would raise that nitrogen isotope value. But there are also peculiarities and differences between the sites. There's a lot of diversity of practice here. So for example, at Koufouvenou, you can see a cluster of high nitrogen isotope values for a particular kind of wheat, free threshing wheat, which is clearly favored in terms of manuring inputs in that local setting. By contrast, at Halai, which is on the far left-hand side, if you can make out in this dense cluster of data points, free threshing wheat actually has relatively low nitrogen isotope values. So different tastes, different land races, different settings, certainly different precipitation levels, as we emphasize in this paper also, are giving rise to different agroecologies and different ways of cultivating individual species. So it's all very well talking about a Neolithic package as a kind of general concept, but when you drill down into the detail and you look not only at what crops are being grown, but at how they are being grown, it's clear that in a sense, each of these communities is developing its own Neolithic. There is no single Neolithic. There is no single, even within mainland Greece, no single way of doing things. There are convergence in some aspects, but there's a lot of diversity also. And something that I would like to draw your attention to as well with regard to Makrialos, which is the central sort of graph that is shown here. Its crop values are all relatively low in terms of nitrogen, though I have to emphasize that we had a relatively small sample size. Something else that's different about Makrialos in comparison to Koufoubono and Halai is that the household unit is less well defined. These are pit houses of the type that we saw much earlier at Mavropigi in the mid-7th millennium in the example that I showed you earlier. And I wonder if that's an expression of labor mobilization being less clearly defined and less deployable in terms of intensive management and practices like manuring at Makrialos in comparison to these other Neolithic settlements, Halai and Koufoubono, where that household unit is architecturally very distinct. Now, I did have a few further slides to share with you to try and develop this point of diversity within the Greek Neolithic further, but I also don't want to test your patience too far in an online talk that has already gone on for 45 minutes. So what I'm actually going to do is address now the final point that I'd like to underline, and that is, I hope, thinking towards, and I hope the questions that you might want to pose to me could help us to develop this further. But I'd like to briefly reflect on what I see as really rich opportunities to develop a process archaeology in relation to Neolithic Europe that I've only really begun to touch on in this short talk. And here are just some of the aspects that I think I'd like to discuss with you. One is that ancient DNA is such powerful evidence of relatedness and of demographic connections, but it cannot alone reveal how or why the Neolithic unfolded as it did. Farming practice, we're now in a position evidentially to move far beyond any simplistic notion of a package. It's a real key opportunity for us to apprehend the Neolithic as a localized series of sequences and as a broader phenomenon, a processual phenomenon. And the final point, provocation that I'd like to put before you is that the spread of the Neolithic is, in some ways, you could understand it as a search for a better Neolithic, a more equal one, a fairer one. And I'm drawing here on ideas that João Fijão, the Portuguese archaeologist, and also the Cambridge archaeologist John Robb have discussed in other contexts, this idea that the spread of the Neolithic is actually a search for something better. And I'll finish there by thanking the co-authors of unpublished work that I've drawn upon here, some of which I didn't have time to fully share with you, but also the AgriCurb project team, which is the ERC-funded project that inspired a lot of this. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Amy. Very fascinating talk, and another talk which sort of bridges the gap in my understanding of at least the Neolithization process throughout Europe. I'm not au fait with Anatolia or that southern region, so thanks again. Tremendous. I've got some questions. It's interesting to note that you end with the comment that a better, fairer, equal Neolithic, when I'm sure it was it Jared Diamond who wrote that basically the onset of the Neolithic is pretty much the beginning of humankind's demise, and that since the Neolithic we've just gone downhill. So it's interesting that other people have conflicting views.
Well, if I can
go for it, yeah.
May I, just because thank you for framing it that way. That's really interesting. I think there is a there has been a tendency to want to find indications in the Neolithic of what we know happens later. And there are all kinds of good motivations for doing that. But it would be tragic, I think, not to appreciate that for all its diversity and of course its different expressions in different parts of the continent, which I haven't done justice to, I couldn't possibly in this talk, but even just in the few examples that I have showed, that the Neolithic does achieve remarkable equality, and that cases like mid-Neolithic Çatalhöyük actually stand out amongst other Neolithic European cases that I didn't particularly dwell upon, that look much more equal in terms of their at least storage-based wealth distribution. I know that there are all different kinds of inequality that one could consider. And so though agriculture can become an engine of inequality, that's not how it began. And that and this is what I found so evocative in the work that I referred to from Tijau and from Rob, is this idea that the Neolithic isn't spreading because it's a better way of life. The Neolithic is spreading because it's an experiment that keeps trying to improve itself, and does that until it hits the far end of the continent and the regions that may be more familiar and of interest to you, Harry.
That's a good point. It might have been Brian Fagan. I can't remember exactly who made the quote. I'll try and find it. It's fascinating.
No, and those generalist kind of positions that come from Fagan and Diamond, they are a great motivator for us trying to really show what the evidence, the complexity that the evidence actually suggests that is in tension with those simple characterizations.
I think your point as well about sort of a fairer Neolithic, or a fairer, let's say, expressing your life way as in a fairer society based on what was it, the surplus and the storage. I think that's actually that's something I'd never considered before. So yeah, do you want to just go a bit further? Are there any other examples?
No, there's so much I had to leave unsaid, so you're giving me a good chance to kind of fill in some explanatory gaps here. Thank you. So we often, that's right, think of farming as an opportunity for surplus production, but when you, of course, study farming, you realize that in fact it's an incredibly risky undertaking, and that if your life depends on it, what you need is a set of very complex complementary strategies for hedging your bets. And so part of the emphasis that I was giving to diversity is about that. And part of the emphasis that I was giving to this notion of a panarchy, of a kind of posse of households that are in it together and that are going to learn from each other, and that, you know, Harry, your crops may just, you know, continually do better for some really unfair reason than Juan's crops and my crops, just because you got a better patch, or you have the green thumbs, or whatever it might be. And this is all kind of well-trod, you know, territory for Neolithic studies. But I think I'm right in saying Çatalhöyük is now giving us an actual evidential basis of how that played out. And the way it played out was that some households were just better at mobilizing labor to their ends than others. And we could, you know, discuss reasons why that might be. I do think the house burning is a reaction to that. And I think we can see that as a mechanism, admittedly only one scenario, but a mechanism for understanding why households do want to disperse themselves out of these then well-established farming areas and into areas where agriculture was a relatively untried proposition, and the incredible risks that they took to do that. I mean, think of all the failed experiments that we can't see archaeologically, right? The ones that we have documented, especially the lengthy occupations through the 6th millennium that I emphasized, those are the relatively successful experiments. And that because of this labor limited nature of farming, it's never about really territoriality or grabbing more land, because there's not much you could do with that additional land. It's about making the best of the labor, the household labor especially, that you can bring to that farming project. And there is a kind of then built-in leveling mechanism to this small scale intensive farming that is, I think, partly why we see a largely egalitarian or relatively egalitarian social system popping up in all these different instances, albeit in very different material culture, very different vernacular forms.
Thanks. You've kind of partly answered my next question, or at least hinted at it. So my next question was the reasoning behind these deliberate acts of, say, destruction or destruction of specific material culture at Châtel. Do you think that is a response to different groups who don't envisage or want to see some sort of equal society or equal framework across the group? It's sort of, well, we've managed to obtain, say, this Emma wheat, for instance, and nobody else is going to have it, so we will destroy it. Or
you could see it that way.
Or is it ritualistic, for instance?
Oh, it's ritualistic, absolutely, as well. I mean, there's going to be layers to this, I imagine. Yeah. You could see it the way you've described it. You could also see it in terms of the houses that get burned. I mean, some of the North area houses that I showed there are also some of the largest. And so in this scenario of relatively unequal labor capacity and therefore agricultural production, those operations are just being shut down. I mean, whatever agencies exactly are being involved, rather than those households sort of continuing and perpetuating themselves further, perhaps inequality becoming greater, it's being leveled. And exactly how the decision-making works around that would be a step too far, probably, in the speculative argument. But the fact is that's what happens, and it happens repeatedly in a tight time frame that is, yeah, I've already emphasized that coincidence, but is also the time frame of the initial neolithization of adjacent regions. And so I don't think it's fanciful to see them as connected, even if the outlines of that scenario are still blurry.
It is fascinating stuff, and that's another site I really need to go and visit at some point, Châtel. And I'll move on to my final question. Nobody's asked any in the chat yet, but if you do, please do ask. But yeah, the last question I had was, so in the stable isotopic study by, I think you mentioned it was your student, Weiglova,
who's now a postdoctoral researcher, Petra Weiglova. Yeah.
Yeah, which you were involved in. How were the different plant taxa identified? It's more of a pernickety question, really. Was it microscopically, or was DNA analysis being undertaken, or what?
No, so it didn't require, I mean, DNA has been needed to resolve some taxonomic questions in some of the assemblages in that project, but no, that's just kind of bread and butter archaeobotany of very well preserved morphologies and comparison with modern reference material. But your question does remind me to say, just as an added layer to the whole diversity aspect of the plant spectrum in the Neolithic, that ancient DNA has revealed that there is another hulled wheat other than einkorn and emmer, which are, like you mentioned, emmer, these are well-known crops of the Neolithic, that there was a third hulled wheat called Triticum timofeevi, or Timofeeves wheat, which is a different genome and a different sequence, a different, genomic complex, separate to emmer and separate to einkorn, which was also part of the Anatolian Neolithic and part of the early spread of crops into Southeastern Europe, into Greece, into Bulgaria. It's also documented up into Central Europe and further still. So DNA has widened the taxonomic range of what we know was involved in that diversity.
again, it's just in comparison to, say, the faunal evidence, it's pretty remarkable that you do have an influx of all these different species of wheat, barley, and these legumes coming in relatively quickly in comparison to, say, you know, you've got obviously first evidence, well, first domesticate, if you will, is dog, and then followed closely by, well, several thousand years by auroch, and then sheep, goat, and pig. There is sort of a delay in these domesticated animals, as opposed to the plants, which just seem to take a hold much quicker.
Yeah, and I think that maybe a contrast that is relevant here that you're reminding me of is in the diversity of the plant spectrum as against what becomes the domesticated faunal spectrum. So faunal analysts are quite happy to talk about the broad spectrum revolution in the late Pleistocene, narrowing in the Neolithic, but that doesn't happen in terms of plants. The broad spectrum revolution just keeps rolling.
Yeah.
And these are largely plant-based diets that we're talking about. And that was, again, something I didn't point out properly from the isotopic evidence, but by including crops and fauna and humans together in the same isotopic mapping of the food system, you can actually prove, you can demonstrate at some of these assemblages, including two of the sites that I showed, Halai and Makrilos, that these are largely plant-based diets. So the diversity is not window dressing. It's fundamental to what is perpetuating this way of life. Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah, it is good. And following on from one final comment then, really, following on from Oliver's talk yesterday, you know, this is something we're beginning to, I say we are, but it's, yeah, collectively the archaeological community and those working on organic residue analysis of ceramics are particularly more focused and keen on trying to identify the presence of plants, which are often overlooked. I mean, at least from a Northern European and my sort of research interest in Scandinavia and what have you, it does take several hundred years into the Neolithic in order to have at least some reasonable evidence in terms of plant macro remains. But again, we need to really refine our methodologies, really, and just keep focusing on the unknown, the classic.
No, that's right, because it will be wonderful to have complementary plant evidence now coming increasingly out of the organic residue, not only lipid, organic residue research. And I really think those of us who are involved directly with archaeobotanical research really need to make clear to the wider community how diverse and how detailed our evidence is for these intricate, largely plant-based systems. And that, you know, like in the art of Chateaubriand, you know, famously the case, there is so much visual celebration of the animal side of things, but that has to be understood in its wider ecological context, including the complexity and the sophistication of these Neolithic plant systems that we could still learn a lot from today. I mean, that's another talk I might have given, but I'm just very motivated now for us to think about plant diversity as one of the lessons from prehistory that we need to be getting out into a wider conversation. Yeah.
100%. Well,
Amy,
I'd like to...
sorry.
Go on, Juan. I don't have any further questions.
Okay. First, congratulations for the conference. I have two questions around the Chateaubriand. I don't know well Chateaubriand. For me, it's amazing to see your pictures. So I'm sorry for my ignorance about Chateau, but I have two questions. How the cereals are stored in the Chateau? All because I think also in Marmota. Okay, it's the cereal is stored in complete spike with in the spikelid, or I don't know. You say in English with
no, in the spikelid,
clean seeds.
So this is such an interesting question, and in some ways there's a really interesting contrast with the evidence I'm thinking from La Marmota, from the Alpine foreland lake dwellings, from La Draga, And that is that at Çatalhöyük, there is either storage of some of the cereals, which are called the ones I was calling the hulled wheats or the gloom wheats, things like einkorn and emmer, which are stored after an initial threshing, but where the grains are still enclosed by their glooms. So they still have some natural protection from pests. So they are stored like that, and that means that they require an additional threshing in something like a mortar and pestle, you know, like a probably wooden deep mortar. Could be on the ground, for example, in a sort of standing pounding position. That's one plausible scenario. There could also be groundstone tool involvement. That's another discussion. So that's for the hulled wheats. For the free threshing cereals, so things like free threshing wheat, the naked barley, which is another major cereal type at Çatal, they are stored as naked grain. So that means that they were processed en masse, you know, in one big event. We have to imagine that, I think, probably beyond the settlement, the edge of the settlement, shortly after harvest time. Okay. So there are two different patterns depending on the kind of natural protection and processing requirements, the anatomy, in other words, of the different cereals. Okay. Whereas in some, yeah. Sorry. No, I was just going to say, at some of the European Neolithic sites, and also interestingly, this has been documented by people like Elena Marinova in the Bulgarian Neolithic, there is a storage of even the entire ear prior to threshing. Yeah. So there are different decisions being made here about the point in the storage sequence at which the bulk of the labor of processing occurs. And Çatalhöyük seems to have a more kind of collective solution, whereas the European Neolithic cases that we're talking about now, including La Marmota, is a more, I think, household-based solution. So the household is becoming more clearly a unit of processing labor, and it's choosing to spread the burden of that processing throughout the year by storing cereals in this unprocessed state.
Okay, in the store areas, is the same area with the people processing the cereal? There are ground stone in the same area with the store area. Is the you find the tools with processing?
There are groundstone processing tools in the houses. Yes, there are, but not for this initial kind of threshing type of processing. This is for, well, in fact, it's not always clear, but there are subsequent processing stages that are definitely taking place within the house, including the dehusking, that is the final cleaning, the final, removal of the chaff from the grain of the hulled wheats. Okay. And the evidence that we have in this is archaeobotanical evidence primarily, is that dehusking is taking place primarily inside the house.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
So thank you for asking me that, because it adds other dimensions to the story.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see. Yes, it's this question around how the serial story is interesting for me, because in Marmota is a different. We found in with the old spike with complete with yes, noise always is the seats clean without the gloom. It's a different situation. You know?
Yes, it's a whole different conception, isn't it, of the point at which storage occurs. That is super interesting.
Okay, thank you. Yeah,
brilliant. Well, thanks again, once again.
That's
Amy,
a pleasure.
that's absolutely brilliant talk. And what's next for you? Are you? I've just seen online actually. You're leading a couple of big projects. Is to tackle some of these questions, I'm assuming.
Yeah, no, that's right. So one is this Explo project, which is an ERC synergy grant with Albert Hafner and Willy Tinner in Bern, and with Kostas Kotsakis, whose work I referred to in Thessaloniki, and that's looking at lakeshore site phenomena of the kind of developed Neolithic in the Western Balkans, So in that part of Southeastern Europe, as a complement to some of the dry site charred evidence that I was emphasizing here. And I mean, the headline, as you can guess, coming from that work is just the diversity story just goes off the roof when you also have waterlogged preservation. So you just see in kind of technicolor detail, just the incredible, variety of the food ecosystem on the plant side, especially. I mean, we're waiting to see what the faunal side will reveal. That's work by Valasia Izakidou, who's a postdoc based here in Oxford as well.
Grand. Well, good luck with the remainder of the project, and look forward to seeing what comes out of it.
This was such fun. Thank you both for the opportunity and for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you.